mainstreaming ecosystem-based adaptation, EBA, and gender equality and social inclusion, GESI, into climate change adaptation. Whether you are joining from the OECS region, the wider Caribbean, or beyond, we extend a very warm welcome and express the hope that you are safe and well in these challenging times. I am Chris Plindeven, Program Coordinator for Climate and Disaster Resilience within the Environmental Sustainability Cluster of the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States OECS Commission. And I am the moderator for today's webinar, which has been organized under the OECS AFD Adaptation Initiative. As many of us know, the Eastern Caribbean islands are particularly vulnerable to climate change due to their geographical location, but also because of the economic makeup, which the economy is being largely dependent on tourism or agriculture, which in turn are highly dependent on natural resources. It is worth noting that evidence from past extreme events highlights the impact of gender on the differentiated capacities of men and women to respond to and recover from disasters and extremes. As climate change continues, transformative adaptation strategies must be implemented to address the immediate climate-related risks, but also to seek to restore degraded ecosystems while taking into consideration social and economic realities. To support developing countries under the implementation of their nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, under the Paris Agreement, and to allow for the increase of climate investments in these countries, Agence Française de Développement, AFD, launched the Adaptation Facility, which is to run from 2016 to 2020. In 2018, the OECS Commission and the Agence Française de Développement, AFD, signed an agreement under AFD's Adaptation Facility. This cooperation agreement benefits all OECS member states. The initiative comprises three components, namely, Component 1, support for the strengthening of institutional capacities and climate governance for the consolidation, implementation, and monitoring of contributions. Component 2, support for the translation of NDCs into sectoral public policies in the field of adaptation. And Component 3 looks at support for the preparation of structural projects and programs in the field of adaptation. Under Component 2, one of the key objectives is capacity building on ecosystem-based adaptation, or EBA, and the mainstreaming of gender into adaptation. Outputs have included workshops for experience sharing and lessons learned, complementary case studies, and the elaboration of regional guidelines on EBA and gender and social inclusion to better incorporate these into NDCs, national adaptation plans, etc. A key deliverable is an EBA and gender and social inclusion toolkit, which will be a focus of today's webinar. At this point, I shall invite my colleague Joan Novell, Program Coordinator for Biodiversity and Ecosystems Management at the OECS Commission, to make brief remarks. Joan?
Yes, good morning, everyone. Greetings from the OECS, the Biodiversity and Ecosystems Management Program. As you are aware, ecosystems-based adaptation is, especially in the context of climate change, is very important to small island developing states. So we welcome this initiative and we thank the AFD as well as the agent team for being able to come up with this toolkit, which I trust that everyone will find useful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joan. So today we'll be considering the question of how to mainstream ecosystem-based adaptation and gender equality and social inclusion into climate change measures. And our objectives today really are to introduce the toolkit to apply an ecosystem-based adaptation and GESI lens to assess the needs to adapt to climate change and identify and select adaptation options and plans to formulate concept notes. So this is an outline of today's agenda, and we have some interesting and exciting presentations by a number of experts. And in the interest of time, I'm going to forego the introductions now, but I'll introduce the speakers as we go along. So we're going to go into our first presentation now, and it is on the current status of EBA and GESI issues in the UNFCCC context, with regard to NAPS, NDCs, etc. And that will be presented by Ventura Silva of the UNFCCC Collaboration Center, the University of St. George's University, Grenada. So, Ventura, you have the floor.
Thank you, Crispin. Well, I'm going to talk on a little introduction to some of the considerations on the gender equality and social inclusiveness, as well as ecosystem-based adaptation within the UNFCCC, and making some requests based on some of the ongoing work of this project and, of course, the countries in the OECS, including the NGOs and other people involved in climate action could participate in some of the ongoing work. So to look at how specifically the gender issue is considered, men and women have different coping and adaptive capacities and different access to and control over resources that translate both gender differentiated vulnerabilities to the impacts of climate change and differentiated strengths to adapt to these changes. People socially, economically, culturally, politically, institutionally, or otherwise marginalized are especially vulnerable to climate change. The young and the old, the indigenous communities, the rural and the urban poor and remote groups and communities have limited adaptive capacity due to their economic status, thereby making them more vulnerable than other members of the society. This has been also identified that in the developing countries, the SIDS, LDCs, these cases might be more prominent than in the developed countries. Recognizing this, the consideration for gender responsive, participatory, and full transparent approach, taking into consideration vulnerable groups, communities, and ecosystems have been specifically stressed, both in context, especially in context of the adaptation planning, the policies. Within the convention, in the references you see here, the COP decisions, COP16 and COP17 decisions, as well as in the Paris Agreement, Articles 7.5 and 7.9c, which directly refers that the parties' consideration that these topics have to be integrated when policy making at national as well as at regional level. So looking specifically at the topic of gender, you will see that this got more prominence, of course, in 2001 was the earliest stage when about the gender representation, the participation of women in negotiations, for special attention was paid. And over the years, of course, this got better and better, where there was more gender equality in the negotiation processes and in the specific committees that were considered. So there is, of course, a UN-wide consideration on gender inclusion in the decision-making processes, in the panels, whether it be negotiation, but also outside in our meetings, in workshops. We try to make sure that there's a gender balance in the panels that we are setting up, of course, considering the topics. But last year, we've seen two important outcomes from the COP in Madrid, which was linked to gender. And then we have, of course, the indigenous groups, which I've not put on the slide here, that also has now a special working group discussing the topic of the impacts of climate actions on, as well as the inclusion of indigenous groups on climate actions. So the key to output that came out on 2019 COP was the second gender action plan, which was, and also the improved Lima work program on gender, which was initiated in the COP in Lima in 2014. So on this slide, could you please click again to get further information on that? The next click. You could click all the details. So here you would see how actually the Lima work program how it's cascading down onto the global gender action plan. So the Lima work program provides a guiding framework for the gender action plans. The current gender action plan, which was set up in 2019, is going on for 5 years. It covers 5 priority areas, which is on capacity building, gender balance, participation and women's leadership, coherence, gender responsive implementation and means of implementation, and monitoring and reporting. So under these work areas, there have been 20 activities that are identified with more than 35 deliverables that have been agreed under the current action plan. If you move on to the next slide, we will look at some of the key topics that are, as I said, that are of interest, because that requires inputs from the countries, which also, if you can see the responsibilities, it allows for not just the countries, which are led by the national climate change focal points and the national gender focal points, which I encourage those countries that have already not appointed a gender focal point to focus on appointing a focal point, because we would be working specifically on the gender issues with these gender focal points. To look at one of the, under the work area of capacity building, knowledge management and communication, the activity A1 is to strengthen the capacity building efforts for governments and other stakeholders in mainstreaming gender in formulating, monitoring and implementation and reviewing as appropriate of the national climate change policies, plans, strategies and actions. So this includes the NDCs. So it's about the work that's been done in the region, like this effort from OECS. We have also some other initiative and gender project, which is happening in the region, covering most of the OECS independent states that are focusing towards capacity building. And we would like this to be communicated. So this is activity that goes up to 2024, COP30. To support on various efforts to implement capacity building. And we would like these efforts to be communicated to the UNFCCC so that this could be shared on the platform that has been created for the activities under the Gender Action Plan, and additional support as required would be provided from UNFCCC. Next slide, please. And this is an action under gender responsive implementation and means of implementation. This is activity D6 under the action, the current gender action plan. This is about exchange of information. So the lessons learned among the parties that have integrated gender into climate change policies, plans, and strategies. Now this is an opportunity that we have with most of the countries involved in the revision of their NDCs this year, that they could have a better representation. You would see also in the tool and the work done that there were only previously in this region 2 countries, St. Vincent and Grenadines and Dominica, which referred to gender in their previous INDCs or NDCs, which in case was in St. Vincent and Grenadines, just a brief reference about gender considerations, but a detailed action plan was needed. And this is what the tool that has been developed by the OECS together with other partners is providing you, that how to best integrate this tool into the decision-making process. So we would like to also use this opportunity on the platform to share experience. There is already a call for submissions that's out, which has been got a deadline of 31st March 2020, but we would encourage parties who have, or the organizations that are working on this topic to submit their experience so far on integrating gender considerations into the national policies. And then there is the other work that's going on, where the other parties could work with their national focal points or climate change focal points and the gender focal points to submit and organize various workshops, dialogues, and expert meetings. Next slide, please. what is important to consider now is on the social inclusiveness and gender equality. What are the entry points for integrating the these considerations into the national determined contributions? Not just a mere reference, but also how do you integrate into various steps, which the tool and the various guidance are provided here specifically for NAPs, but also in the NDCs. You could see how this tool could be used in order to integrate the gender considerations and also the social inclusiveness, including reference to the indigenous groups, the various social segments of the countries, the young, especially how do you engage the youth in climate action and also consider the impacts, especially in the consideration for the NAPs on youth and how those could be addressed. Into the NDCs, but also the long-term low-emission development strategies, which the OECS independent states are still, in some countries, of course, there are considerations, but it is at a very early stage of development. So this is an opportunity for you to how to consider these. And here you see some of the processes on the national analysis and consultations to understand the national context better, how these different elements play a role in the climate activities, then developing an institutional framework and coordination mechanism in order to integrate and implement, and aligning of national policies and planning instruments so that they all talk to each other and also address the various elements. You will have, of course, support from various UN agencies, as well as other multilateral and bilateral development partners who have a keen interest on this topic, on how to consider these in, for example, in just transition, on your mitigation actions, but on the adaptation, how these elements could be considered, and then the monitoring and evaluation. So this is why it's important to understand how you would not merely just refer to gender inclusiveness, but how do you actually integrate that and implement it in these policies and strategies. Next slide, please. So for further engagement, I have provided with the organizers with some extra slides on the references of some of the other guidance that could supplement the toolkit that has been developed, especially on the integration of these elements into the NDCs. We have consideration for gender. There was some work that had been done by UNFCCC on by the LEG, the Least Development Countries Expert Group, on how do you consider the vulnerable groups in ecosystem-based adaptation context. And of course, there was a special guidance on gender. But I've seen that the tool that was developed by OECS actually had integrated most of these elements in that tool, where it has made references and worked on it more in the context of the OECS region. So, but those who are interested in this additional information could refer to these elements. And also, I will encourage everyone to submit for the two open calls that I meant on the lessons learned, and also share the experience of engaging women groups and national women and gender institutions in the process of developing, implementing, and updating climate policies. So this, the ongoing work on the NDCs, although we have a situation where there is limited interactions, it's permitting us, but there is, of course, other means like how we are engaging right now through the virtual meetings to see how best you could, in the current context, engage these groups, and where this information is already available to share with the UNFCCC for including into the platforms that is being created. With this, I'd like to thank the organizers and thank you. Back to you, Crispin.
Thank you very, very much, Venturo, for the presentation. Just to inform participants that that we have a question and answer session later on, but you're free to post your questions in the chat for the time being, and we'll address those questions when we come to the Q&A and discussion session. Without further ado, though, I will move on to the next presentation, which is on the impacts of climate change on the Eastern Caribbean region. That is a presentation prepared by Pascal Safache of the University of the French West Indies.
Yes, good morning all. This is Fernanda Zermoglio. I will be presenting on behalf of Dr. Safache the slides around impacts of climate change in the Eastern Caribbean region. The majority of the slides that I'm going to be showing to you are sourced from a climate report, which was compiled with inputs from many partners in the region by the Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology, including, of course, the University of the French West Indies and many others. The report looked at both current trends in climate dynamics, temperature and rainfall dynamics, as well as future projections of these parameters. And I will provide only the main highlights here. So the slide that you see in front of you is it outlines some of the major changes that are projected for the Eastern Caribbean. You can see that temperatures are projected to continue rising somewhere between 1.5 and 5 degrees Celsius over the course of the next century. In addition to that, and more importantly, the evidence is emerging that heat stress is becoming quite a significant factor across the OECS region. And the importance of heat stress cannot be understated, as heat stress can, of course, affect human health. It increases heat-related mortality and morbidity, particularly in persons with lower fitness or respiratory illnesses. It also can increase the range of vector-borne diseases such as dengue, malaria, and others. We know, for example, that many mosquitoes that carry malaria survive and in fact reproduce and bite more frequently at higher temperatures, and therefore they're more apt to transmit the disease. In addition to that, in terms of human health, there is a rise worldwide across the agricultural communities in the impact and the frequency of liver disease, particularly for agriculture workers, as heat stress begins to increase dehydration for those workers. Another impact of heat stress, of course, is going to be on water management, both through the increased evapotranspiration rates for surface water sources and reservoirs, as well as sort of looking in the future, particularly towards the latter part of the 21st of the century. It reduced water flows, surface flows, even in the most large rivers of the region. For the impacts of heat on education, there is emerging evidence and quite a big literature around the reduced ability for children to learn as temperatures increase. In addition to education impacts, you will see an increased cooling demand and increased energy demands for already a stress sector in the region. As I mentioned before, heat stress can impact agricultural workers, and there's a high potential of loss of hours of productivity due to heat stress as well. From an environmental perspective, we know that heat stress can exacerbate drought conditions, facilitate wildfires, and put stresses on both animal populations as well as ecosystems. And as you probably all well know, food security due to crop failure, heat stress or wilting will certainly increase, as well as the morbidity in livestock as a result of heat stress. And finally, and most importantly, in the urban environments, you will see an increased need for cooling centers for communities at risk, and an increased need for cool construction and home cooling techniques, such as efficient ventilation and, of course, high energy demanding technologies such as air conditioning. Next slide, please. In terms of drought, what you see on this slide is essentially the historical occurrence of drought on your left-hand side for the smaller islands of the Eastern Caribbean with the gentle slopes. and the steeper islands on the right-hand side. The heat season will be twice as long, so it will be 6 months in the future, from May to October. And with heat waves as early as March and as late as November, they imply a general drying trend for the Caribbean basin of 25 to 30%, which will obviously produce additional drought. And the longer and more frequent, and dry spells can pose a significant risk to rain-fed production, which is of course a common practice in the region. And as I mentioned before, even the largest rivers and surface water reservoirs can be affected, both limiting freshwater availability and triggering drought impacts across a multitude of socioeconomic sectors, which of course you're very familiar with. You can see on this slide also that the dry spells in the areas with low topography and the islands with low topography peak between March and May. And of course, that is going to change as we extend the heat season, whereas the dry spells in the more mountainous regions are obviously more confined. What this means in the longer term is that in the smaller non-topographically varying islands, planting sensitive crops without adaptation measures or supplemental irrigation may be too risky at any time of the year. Whereas in contrast, in the mountain areas, the periods between June and December are potentially risk-free periods and will be and crops may not be subject to drought. Next slide, please. 3 additional impacts that are worth mentioning is the changing nature of extreme rainfall. Extreme rainfall comes from a variety of sources. So as temperatures rise, we have an intensified hydrological cycle, which makes more clouds, and then that cloud falls as heavy rain. Of course, our ability to capture that heavy rain and take advantage of it in terms of storage for addressing periods of droughts is limited when it arrives all in one sort of fell swoop. In addition to that, of course, we have extreme rainfall coming from projected increase in category 4 and 5 hurricanes for the Caribbean region moving forward. And this is relatively new information from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. In addition to obviously an increase in flash flood potential, rivers, roads becoming rivers, for example, in many urban areas across the coast, you will see an increase in, excuse me, in landslides and soil erosion, as you're sort of very familiar with the impact of hurricanes in the region and their destructive nature across both infrastructure as well as the natural environment. Warmer sea surface temperatures and less saline seas are likely to continue. The salinity of the oceans will certainly affect fish migration patterns, and of course, this is a critical source of protein for the region. And finally, the sea level rise range of projections is 20 centimeters to 2 meters over the course of the next 100 years. But if you look at the next slide, this is data from Dr. Safash, and what he is showing here is that sea level is already rising. You all of course know this, but it has important implications for coastal structures, tourism networks, transport networks, as well as communities. And the protected defenses such as mangroves and seawalls will certainly need to be revisited and re-engineered in order to address that risk, both in terms of rising seas as well as the attendant increased storm surge that emerges from that. And the next slide, please. Sorry, there is an animation there. That's it. The next slide, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fernanda. Thank you. And I guess, like I didn't introduce you for the first presentation, which was by Dr. Safash, but Fernanda Zamovia is an adaptation specialist, and she'll be presenting a general overview of the OECS EBA and Gender and Social Inclusion Toolkit, looking at a three-step approach. Fernanda, once again, you have the floor.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much. Again, thank you very much for allowing me to speak today. It's a pleasure to at least have the opportunity to meet virtually in these trying times. I hope everyone is safe and well wherever you are joining the meeting from. The objective of this presentation is really to provide an overview of the toolkit that we have developed as part of this project. And the toolkit is really meant to provide guidance on how to effectively mainstream ecosystem-based adaptation and gender and social equality issues or considerations into your climate change actions. In addition to definitions, case studies, and examples, the toolkit is really meant to provide a step-by-step guidance on how to bring in considerations of ecosystem-based adaptation or nature-based solutions and gender into a project, a document, or a project proposal. So if you can just stay on that slide. The toolkit essentially has 3 steps. I'll walk through some of the illustrative examples of these 3 steps, but I think it's important to mention that essentially under each step we have the what. So what the objective of the step is. So in the case of step 1, the objective is to essentially establish the context and assessment and the context of climate risks within your area of work. It involves, you will have in the toolkit examples on how to establish that context, resources that you could use, questions that you can ask. If you can just scroll down and make sure that all of the questions appear on the slide. One more, that's it. Perfect. Questions, guiding questions that you can ask in order to address this step. And importantly, considerations, particularly regarding gender, on how to bring in the gender perspective into the process, the process of sort of addressing this step. So it's the what is the objective of the step, the how, guiding questions and examples of tools that can be used to address this. It's important to mention that we are summarizing tools that are widely available and had been tested across the field rather than developing our own new tools. The why, really sort of considerations and guidance on why this is relevant for the process of integrating ecosystem-based adaptation into your projects. And the who, again, as mentioned here, how do you bring in gender-sensitive considerations into the equation. So the first step, it illustrates how to gather information about the development context, how to gain a better understanding of the policy, socioeconomic and institutional, as well as ecological context of the area you're working, as well as sort of helping you to formulate the problem and the need for a specific project. Next slide, please. The second step is really meant to help you identify adaptation measures. So once you understand the risks to both the ecosystems as well as differential risks to men and women or youth and others in step 1, this step helps you identify what you can do about those risks. So let us assume, for example, that an increasing water stress is a risk for agricultural agriculture workers in a region. This step would help you identify strategies to address that. If you are in one of the low-lying islands, as mentioned before, not implementing adaptive measures means a very significant and probably 100% risk to your agricultural sector. So for example, you may want to introduce drought-tolerant crops, shorter season varieties, drip irrigation or strategies to address water shortages, more saline tolerant species, things of this nature. So this step really helps you to identify what those strategies are, first of all, or what they could be. We provided some examples from the small island developing nations across the world, rather than just focusing on the Caribbean region, but really focusing on the needs and the risks and the capacities available within small island developing nations. In addition to that, this step does also help you to understand how you may prioritize those. So I'm sure that many of you have been engaged in the process of developing either national communications or NAPAs or NDCs. And in that process, you essentially have a risk, some strategies, and a list of those risks and strategies. When this guidebook is really meant to help you establish some priorities of what should be done now in the medium term and in the long term. And then the guiding questions that you see to your right, of course, are questions that are very specific to gender, so that gender and social equality, so that you are better able to capture both the needs of different groups of people within this risk profile, but as well as the potential opportunities that emerge from engaging those groups and getting buy-in from those groups in order to implement adaptation strategies. The next slide, please. And the final step in the process is really meant to guide you in developing a concept note, whether that concept note is directly integrated into Green Climate Fund strategy or just other strategic documents that can help secure funding and for adaptation. Obviously, there is some guidance on that. It really is a process of preparing a project document, including designing a monitoring and evaluation approach with very specific EBA and GESI related indicators. The step also guides you through the design and formulation of policy and project concept notes, and offers insights on how to design a project plan or policy to guide climate finance planning for these issues. Again, important to mention that there is, sorry, can you click the slide one more time? There are considerations that are offered in terms of sort of guidance for how you might conduct this step. What resources are available to help you in supporting and conducting that step? Support you in conducting that step. Excellent. And with that, I will mute myself before the dog starts to bark. My apologies to all.
Thank you very much, Belinda. We shall now move on to lessons learned and best practices on ecosystem-based adaptation by Jonathan McHugh of Sustainable Seas. He's an EBA specialist. And Jonathan, you have the floor.
Great, thank you, Crispin. To keep to time, I'll move on. But just to start, so everyone's on the same page, I'm going to start with briefly explaining what are ecosystems and what is ecosystem-based adaptation. Basically, an ecosystem includes all living and non-living species within a particular place. And that's different to what a habitat is, which is basically a place where the particular living species lives. And it's an important differential to make within this toolkit. EBA is an integrated management approach to design adaptation actions that recognize the full array of interactions between an ecosystem. And if countries get this right, it can have a twofold effect. First of all, it can help communities to adapt to climate variables that are being experienced. And secondly, it helps to integrate the use of a term which I'm sure you've all heard of, which is ecosystem services, to achieve, their sustainable exploitation, conservation, and restoration. So in many ways, an ecosystem could be referred as a society where a habitat are the homes where different parts of the society live. But also, importantly, when we're talking about EBA, we're saying that we should be working with nature and not competing with it. And I think that's one of the main driver points of this toolkit. Next slide, Crispin. EBA has three major focuses, and these are reflected within the three toolkits that Fernanda has explained, and they articulate the following. The first one is understanding ecosystem functioning and continuous adaptation to ecosystem dynamics collectively are more important than any one fixed term solution. And this fits perfectly with step one of the toolkit, because what we need to understand is, what is the context? And we need to sort of understand, the implications of not having all our information to hand to make decisions. Secondly, it aims to produce flexible plans rather than a blueprint for an end state. And what that basically means is it's important to be iterative. It's important to be flexible in our approach. And this is where step two of the toolkit comes in, because it's going to provide decision makers with the options available to better understand what step one has told us so that appropriate interventions can be made. Thirdly, it's based on continuous acquisition, updating and analysis of information and data related to ecosystem change and intervention. So as we've just heard, the criticality of being able to set up workable and meaningful monitoring systems so we can learn and evaluate performance is integral to a successful concept project, and hence the information that we have presented in step three. Next slide, Crispin. Three collective observations have been learnt from the OECS country missions that we undertook in 2019. Firstly, in blue, we agreed that initial setup costs plus future maintenance costs of any EBA intervention are far less than any traditional engineering approach that could be pursued. So in other words, it's a much cheaper solution. Secondly, to the right, no evidence was really gained from OECS nations visited that suggests that EBA interventions are really being implemented for the, let's say, the medium to the long term. The aspiration is there, but the on-the-ground evidence is going to be requiring continued funding. So the implication of this is it's quite very difficult to demonstrate EBA success, especially over political timescales, such as 3 or 4 years. And thirdly, at the bottom, you'll see that most EBA pilot interventions, not projects per se, often appear to be spatially restricted in scale, with no on-the-ground examples found of what I call a landscape scale ecosystem intervention that covers a range of habitats. Despite this, there are many examples within the region of donor project level, sort of national or regional initiatives that embrace ridge to reef principles. And I'll come on to that in a later slide. So importantly, these three observations all relate to a better appreciation of, through step one of the toolkit, which is purposely designed to improve understanding of a site's context, climate change related predictions and observations, in addition to societal needs. So regarding local lessons learned, one key observation is that EBA approaches should only be designed after a thorough assessment is made of all social, ecological, and physical factors in order to better appreciate what's happening in an area. The toolkit uses one example from St. Vincent, which demonstrates quite an innovative approach that was adopted by Richmond Vale Academy on St. Vincent Main Island to initiate a community-focused home garden program. This was designed in response to a need to improve the qualities of soils within a watershed, which were deteriorating as a consequence of climate change. The approach adopted is reflected within step one of the toolkit, and it's used as a good exemplar of the need to use two separate baseline recording sheets. And these are now presented, as you can see on the screen. The one on the left focuses on the extent and status of key ecosystems in an area, plus understanding their condition and health, and who are dependent upon these services that it provides. Whilst the second table, to the right, focuses specifically on the detail of the ecosystem service activity being provided. There are also here an opportunity to capture additional gender sensitive information to help support priority adaptation designs. This case example will be picked up again following my talk by Lisa in the next discussion. Next slide, Crispin. We just heard from Fernanda, who's talked about the importance of understanding climate parameters, such as sea level rise, to better determine what approach or intervention is most applicable for a specific site from an engineering, an environmental, and a socioeconomic perspective. Even though EBA interventions are relatively new, the experience from around the world is showing us that nature-based solutions can and should be proposed as effective, sustainable, and cost-effective alternatives to traditional engineering solutions. That said, hard engineering, of course, has its place. However, I think we can probably all appreciate that there are very few examples where man can engineer situations that totally replicate what natural systems intend to do. It's important that EBA interventions are not interpreted as simply the substitution of man-made infrastructure for natural replacements in order to improve an ecosystem's functionality. In many situations, what are called hybrid solutions, and that's a combination of natural and anthropogenic interventions, are often needed to achieve the intended outcome. The slide shows a table from the toolkit that outlines a range of interventions whereby EBA plays a key role in project delivery. The toolkit presents a very interesting example again from St. Vincent, of the Ashton Lagoon Rehabilitation Project on Union Island. I use this as an example because this intervention focuses on ecosystem rehabilitation of a previously failed private sector marina development on the island. The approach demonstrates that by introducing and implementing the generic EBA principles into the project concept, that environmental and societal improvements can be achieved to help rehabilitate an already damaged footprint that was caused by basically poor planning and decision making. And within a relatively short space of time, the coastal ecosystems at Ashton Lagoon are being restored by blending a combination of engineering excavation interventions, such to improve water circulation, with more nature-based interventions linked to mangrove planting and wider rehabilitation. This hybrid approach adopted, whilst maybe not preferred by the purist as being arguably 100% pure nature-based solution, does represent an EBA approach that is relevant for this site. It's an important point to make, as by simply adhering to a pure nature-based solution, in other words, without any man support or engineering intervention, the time required to achieve the intended outcome would have taken many more years, if at all. So importantly, step 2 of the toolkit is designed to help decision makers to make these decisions and to select appropriate and suitable approaches and ask the right questions, which are based on scientific and community-related findings that are supported by the information provided from a robust approach to step 1. Next slide, Crispin. So some core principles for EBA implementation are presented within the toolkit that should be used to help support any future project concept design. And these are all presented in more detail within step 3 of the toolkit. And you can see a list of what is just 7 on the screen now. But to make these implementable, the principles need to be mainstreamed, meaning that it's important to integrate them in tandem with climate risks into development plans, NAPs, NDCs, and other policies and regulatory processes within a specific country. Whatever is being considered, be it a policy or be it a project, it's important that the approach defined in step 3 is adhered to in order to create donor-compliant climate adaptation projects that not only achieve the intended objectives, but they seek to embrace suitable EBA solutions that are appropriate to a specific site, whilst ensuring that it doesn't, in the process, increase exposure of vulnerable communities to climate-related hazards. Final slide. So the words, I like to end with these interesting slides, but the words of Albert Einstein excellently articulate the way that decision makers now need to think with regards to EBA. And he said, we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them. So our new way of thinking calls for a flexible and innovative approach. And that is the way that the toolkit has been designed. Key to this, and built within the messages embedded within the toolkit, is that everyone should benefit from any investment in an equitable manner. Often the missing link is how we can consistently bring societal and nature-based elements together so that both are mutually applied and that both support each other to achieve intended climate resilient outcomes. So you've heard my findings from an EBA perspective very rapidly. I'll now pass over to Lisa that will pick this up from a gender and social inclusion perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Jonathan. And as you said, we will pass on to Lisa, who is a gender specialist. So lessons learned and best practices of gender equality and social inclusion. Lisa.
Thank you, Crispin. Thank you, John, and good morning, everyone. So I'm just gonna jump straight in looking at some of the lessons learned and best practices from the GESI perspective. Building on what John has presented, in our field work, I found some similar perspectives in terms of how gender equality and social inclusion were being mainstreamed into activities that were hybrid or were slight EBA or perhaps broader and deeper nature-based solutions. In the context of that, we also found that perhaps there was inconsistent attention to gender, and in some cases that was because of a lack of understanding or knowledge of gender and the difference between gender equality and women's empowerment, and also how to do it in very practical ways. So some of what we are trying to do in the toolkit is to try to provide some useful tools and tips that will help to apply some of these complex considerations in practical ways to ensure that they can be done consistently and regularly. In this first slide, you will see some of the considerations that I think stand out from the work, and they kind of reflect issues that were raised not only by John, but by Fernanda and Ventura as he discussed the Lima work program. In fact, we're looking at a number of issues. So some of them are access issues in terms of opportunities for work and the type of work and the kinds of income that we can generate from those activities. Also, we see a slow rate of recovery for some groups, some subgroups, and some households in a post-disaster or a post-climate related impact event. We also see that not everyone necessarily has access or the same access to decision-making and to the political processes to be able to reflect their experiences and the challenges that they're facing. We also need to look at the issue of security and physical safety. These are issues that sometimes are barriers to persons participating. And for example, when we went on our field trips, persons were talking about some of the issues that arose for persons in the community wanting to participate in activities that took place at night, for example. And then also there is the fact that we have a lot of reliance on informal networks and social capital, which is important and critical, but it is not always enough to help those who are most vulnerable to withstand the impacts of some of the events and changes we're seeing, and also to be more resilient to other challenges that are coming. And so these are some of the issues that we think it's important to consider, particularly in step 1 of the toolkit, and to consider as you go through the toolkit and look towards what kinds of actions and how you will be doing those actions in your climate adaptation activities. Next slide, please. Critical in this, and to build on what John's presented, is that while we're looking at the EBA on the social inclusion side, it's important to look at the 2 columns to the right. Who or what is causing the degradation and who is most dependent? And it's important in that context to look at not just the livelihoods issues, but the use issues and the dependency issues. Sometimes these are the same person and sometimes they're not. And we think the value of this tool is to be able to break down some of that and to understand who is driving the degradation, and therefore, and the impacts are not only economic, they're also social, they're affecting the livelihoods of other persons, and how can you address this in a way that also resolve conflicts And as we know, sometimes conflicts in our region are not as obvious as they are in other places, but they tend to come up in meetings and they tend to come up when we're talking about proposing solutions. And so this helps everyone to come into the discussion and to talk about some of the things that are not written in reports and are not so obvious. Next slide, please. When we did look at the region, though, we actually found that there was a good range of different activities and investments that I think it's important to highlight. I think what we learned from this is that there's this range, but sometimes what you have is that in some countries, there's really good examples at the local community level, but not much happening at the sectoral level, and the national policies are not perhaps reflecting the gender and social inclusion aspects at all or very well, or reflecting what's happening. In some cases, you have the opposite. So what we're thinking and suggesting for the toolkit is that we need, as probably is best outlaid in the UNFCCC guidelines, is the need for investment at the national level, at the sectoral level, and at the community level. And we have here a range of good examples, I think, about how the region has really jumped in and looked at ways in which you can bring that social and environmental aspect of climate adaptation and resilience building together. So I will just highlight a couple. So you see, for example, the fact that Grenada has a gender-sensitive national adaptation plan. And the process they went through and the elements they're looking at is even further bolstered by the fact that they have probably one of the more robust gender policies in the region right now. And that combination is also important for being able to do the mainstreaming more effectively. We also have at the sectoral level in at least 3 countries, efforts to make sure that financing through the banking system and otherwise is available to support businesses and other actors. And that's a critical element if we think about some of the impacts we've observed, whether it's Hurricane Irma and Maria most recently, or we go back to Ivan 15, 20 years ago. These are important considerations also about how the region has learned, perhaps slowly, but learned and adapted and really sought to make sure that from the lessons that have been learned from different events, they can integrate it into the kinds of offerings and the kinds of services that are going to be important for climate adaptation. And we also have a range of different activities at the community level, whether it's co-management approaches around mangrove ecosystems, or its broader work, as John has mentioned, about looking at backyard home gardens, which are being implemented in a way that considers both the social and the environmental, and looking at how that is balanced with other activities and other investments on the ecosystem-based side. Next slide, please. So an example here, jumping into Grenada, where I visited and spent at least 2 or 3 weeks. You have the Recon project, which is a restoration project, but also a co-management project and a project that looks at livelihoods. And this project was very interesting because of the number and the range of activities that it sought to implement to address both the social and the environmental aspects linked to climate change adaptation. So you have on one hand, the collaborative effort at the community level with experts to actually implement the mangrove restoration. And you see here 2 representatives of the community of Telescope in St. Andrew, who are actually actively there planting mangrove seedlings and will be involved also in the monitoring and the stewardship to make sure that the services that the mangrove can provide are there, are owned by the community, and are going to be sustained and supported also by other activities they'll be undertaking. In the other picture we see capacity building and awareness building. And so you see the representative of the government of Grenada and the Ministry of Environment working with colleagues at the stakeholder community level, discussing how these activities link in at the sectoral level and at the national level and the national priorities. That is a really important element also for that more broader social inclusion aspect that the toolkit talks about. And this was also important because one of the things that the project did when it looked at what was causing the degradation, for example, and the need for these ecosystem services was charcoal production. And while this was an issue, what the approach they took was to actually look at what are some of the alternatives that could be provided that would provide similar kinds of income, similar rate of income that could support that transition and that diversification. And one of the things they looked at was beekeeping. They also looked at issues of, opportunities for nature tourism, for also greater ownership, not only by the community, but surrounding communities and visitors to understand the wealth that was actually available in the ecosystems and the other opportunities that could possibly be generated. Also, they looked at how this could be linked to the marine protected areas investments that were being made around the area of St. Andrew and other areas, and why it was important to think of those linkages, including working with fisher folk and persons who would perhaps be also doing fishing in the coastal area. Next slide, please. The next example I'm going to talk about is the home gardens in St. Vincent, the Pass It On project. And again, this is a very interesting one. As John would have mentioned, this is an opportunity at the community level to address a number of issues, if you think of the SDGs. So beyond the climate, we're looking at issues of food security, we're looking at issues of income generation, and we're looking at also the reduction of food costs, because we are a region where we import a significant amount of our food. This is variable, but it is a factor of the reality in the region. And so this project was very interesting. Its target was young, vulnerable women. And it engaged with them in a number of ways that sought to improve household income and also security. It was important because they also looked at sustainable farming practices, organic practices, and crop diversification that were in keeping with the surrounding environment. It also sought to ensure that as they did the work, they promoted and they protected the local biodiversity. And critically for me, as a gender person, was this focus on non-toxic fertilizer. This is very important because in the broader environmental realm, there's a lot of work going on about persistent organic pollutants, chemicals, etc. And one of the things that we're seeing more and more in the literature and in the science is the fact that there are gendered impacts from overexposure to chemicals. And these are physical, these are health related, and they affect men and women differently. And they're also increasing concerns and the need to make sure that we're aware that for women of reproductive age, they really should be wearing protective gear. They should be really well informed before they start using potentially highly toxic fertilizers. And so these are some of the really important opportunities and links that are being made that we have tried to highlight in the toolkit, and hopefully this will also spur additional innovation in other countries and in other communities as they do this kind of work. Next slide, please. Last but not least is thinking about the doing. And as John said, we hope this toolkit can inspire you to build on what you're already doing and to do newer and even greater things in bringing EBA together with social inclusion and gender equality considerations. What I wanted to say here was that we see a lot of work, and so there's a sense that there's an awareness of both gender and EBA in the region. And that is a good thing, and it's a good foundation to build on, but it only takes us so far. We also see that in some cases, perhaps a little rare, we see more sensitive kinds of investments that are making some very explicit contributions and that are addressing important gaps. Again, that takes us forward. What we perhaps think is important to consider more and more as we develop the next phase and the next phase of proposals is to think about how we can be more responsive in these investments. Certainly to make that contribution of the longer term. And that means really significant effort. It means really well-targeted investments that consider not just engagement, but also benefit sharing and resource sharing. At the end of the day, these are small islands and there's a lot of competition over the resources, and we need to think about the resource sharing element, particularly in the context of climate adaptation, as well as resilience building. Right now, we're in COVID-19, and we can see clearly how issues of resource sharing are becoming more and more tangible and more visible in our communities as we think about grocery shopping, access to certain basic goods. The same things are going to apply also as we do our work in climate adaptation. I will just end off with my own little quote, which comes from the Keto Foundation in Carriacou, and which says basically that this is a great opportunity for the social and the environmental to come together. But in reality, if we think through this issue, they should never have been apart. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for that presentation, which is our final presentation. And very shortly, we will go into our question and answer session. But just before I hand over to my colleague, Joseph Edward Charlemagne, again of the OECS Commission, to lead us in the question and answer session. I just want to let you know that we will be inviting you to provide feedback on the EBA and gender quality webinar to assist us in maintaining and improving the quality and relevance of our work. And so very shortly, we'll be launching a poll, which it'll just take 5 minutes or less to complete. So I'll be doing that very shortly. But Josette, in the meantime, you have the lead us into the question and answers. I know some of them may already have been answered, but I leave that to you. Thank you very much.
Hi, Lisa. There's one question for you. In the Caribbean, when we talk about gender issues, we tend to associate gender with feminism. How do you integrate gender issues while at the same time making that it's about integration but not power relations?
Thanks. I took a quick look at the question, so I already started to think of my response. So yes, we do have this issue, and of course, feminism is part of any effort to look at gender equality. Gender cannot be separated from power relations. They are inevitable. And power relations don't just necessarily mean between men and women. There are also power relations between sectors, between economic actors, and also between political influencers. So this power issue cannot be divorced from work on gender equality and social inclusion. The reason for looking at both of these is because we have to deal with these power realities. And this is important because if you're saying that you want to change behavior and uses of resources, one of the questions you have to ask is the person you're targeting, does that person have the power to change? And that is an issue not just of their physical capacity, but about their economic reliance and also about their political power and influence in terms of if they can even get together and combine to make some of those changes possible. And so when we do our work on gender equality, it is about integration because we want to make sure that those social issues and those environmental issues are dealt with at the same time and not separately as we have tended to do them in the past. But we also need to make sure that when we're doing this, we're looking at the socio-environmental aspects as well. I tend to do a lot of work now on social and environmental safeguards and risks. And one of the things we really need to think about is where the social and the environmental combine to contribute to some of the problems that we're talking about. With issues like water and water use. There are social uses of water, there are economic uses of water, there are environmental uses of water. And sometimes the social uses of water highly depend on the environmental uses of water as well, if you think about our ecosystems. And so part of the gender lens is not just about the difference between men and women. It is also about understanding and unpacking some of these issues, and also understanding where age is important, where geography is important, where ability and disability is important, where ethnicity is important, and where class is important. Because it gets back to that power. If we want to change how we use resources, some people are more capable. If you look at the issue with plastics, and I think most countries in the region have gone through this, not everyone has the capacity to move from plastics to bamboo. The costs are very different. And so if we're trying to make that change, we then have to think, what do we need to do to enable someone who has less economic capacity to be able to do that? And so I would say that it is not an either or, but it's doing both, and also making sure that no one feels excluded or left behind. At the same time, if our focus is on who's most vulnerable and who needs more support, there will be a differentiation of support we provide in some cases to men and women, or men or women, and sometimes to different people in society. Because again, what we're trying to do is to enable everyone to be able to make that change and to be able to contribute to the changes and the adaptation and resilience that we're trying to build. I hope that helps to respond to the question.
Thank you. Kristen, we may continue.
Well, the question, are there any more questions coming in? So we have a few more minutes.
Yes.
So please proceed.
I have a question from Diane Roberts. While COVID-19 is uncharted territory, is there any possible links between the increased prevalence of the disease and climate change? Secondly, is there any observed gender implications or trends regarding infections and recovery?
Any of our presenters want to tackle that question, or our experts?
This is Fernanda. I guess I would just say that there is no evidence linking COVID extent and potential infection rates to any climate parameters. Obviously, there's anecdotal thinking that this will potentially go away when the climate gets warmer, but it flies in the face of what we're seeing in terms of a spread across the world, including in the Caribbean and the Southern Hemisphere. In terms of gender implications, I believe that has been covered quite significantly. Obviously, there's a differential impact and exposure for women who are tasked with going out and doing things like the shopping, etc. But from a climate perspective, it's very difficult at the moment to tell. There's not enough data to suggest that there are direct climate links to COVID spread and impacts.
If I may,
Thank you for that. I have.
Yeah, there are no direct climate impacts, but how it spreads are the different conditions that it's created through climate change. Well, not on the longer term, but on a shorter term, will have some consequences on how we address the issues. Especially like right now, we are looking towards the hurricane season and how the measures that have been taken by different Caribbean countries, how it's going to impact basically the one is on the contamination and how it will impact the other activities linked that are planned for the hurricane season, for example, would be some of the implications that would be needed to be considered.
And one, it's Jonathan here. An interesting example I'm going to give you on that, and there's no direct link to COVID-19, but I'm going to use Tunisia in North Africa as an example. But it is linked to climate change. What's happening along the coast in Tunisia during the summer, the very hot summers, are that what are essentially, more nomadic groups of people living in the desert, they're moving to the cooler coast along the Mediterranean. What's happening along the coast of Tunisia is that you're then getting new communities living very close together along to 1 or 2 kilometers of coast because it's cooler and they can sort of work and live closer together. Now, the implications for COVID-19 are that potentially climate change is one of the factors which is creating different ways that communities are living. And so if that is a link, then that's an interesting discussion that does link with the spread of diseases that are respiratory, such as COVID-19, as a consequence of climate change. So if people are moving to, cooler environments during the summer and COVID-19 is hitting, then you could argue that people are, as opposed to being nomadic and spread, they are living closer together, hence creating more of a problem for countries such as Tunisia.
The question is from Kent Thomas. For gender inclusivity, what are the key performance indicators and how is the OECS so far on these indicators? I see a lot of qualitative information, but very little quantitative data. We can say it's doing good or great, but great could be anything better than nothing. Another question from Kelly Armstrong. Some islands have experienced multiple disasters in a 12-month period. When we discuss impacts, are there any considerations for mounting stress due to recovery or lack thereof from multiple disasters? How do we evaluate and quantify that in terms of capacity to adapt?
Do you want me to answer or?
I would
yes, please.
Have a go, Lisa. Yeah, I was thinking of answering that myself, but I think it's more of a societal question, which I think you could probably address.
And did I hear Venturo maybe wanted to say something? No? Okay. So to the last question, yes, we did consider in the case study analysis and fieldwork we did, as well as the toolkit, that we do have this issue of multiple impacts and also sometimes cascading effects on the ability to adapt and also to build resilience. And so we do reflect some of that in terms of the toolkit, and the reason for some of the tables that we've presented is also to try to capture some of those, because sometimes what we find is that even if an event is 1 year, 2 year, 3 years in the past, there's still lingering effects that are still occurring. And so part of the reason for having that discussion, not only in terms of the, as I said, the impact on the ecosystem, but what's driving the degradation, to understand which of those are environmental, which of those are social, which of those are economic. It's also to be able to pick up some of those factors. And then the box that John showed about the activities, again, it's to try to bring through some of those. Now, there is not a perfect solution to how you deal with this. I think most of the robust climate risk and vulnerability assessments that are out there should be capturing this information. And this is critical for you to do as in step one, before you start even identifying what the problem is in detail and before you start deciding on solutions. One of the ones that I think is strongest in this is the one by CARE, because it has a very strong integration of gender from the get-go. And it allows for some of the issues that you're talking about, including the ones that don't make it into reports. On the other hand, what I can say is that the post-disaster needs assessments that we do have in the region are usually a good reflection point for looking at some of those, and some of those that might have transferred between one event and the other. And I remember that the one in Dominica, for example, did actually have a very specific level of looking at gender. It was a small percentage, but it was the first time I actually saw that. And it does give you an idea of the kind of impact that it can have for an event and over time. And my last point on this question is that with the Engender project that Ventura mentioned in his presentation, and the fact that I see both UN Women and UNDP looking at past events, collecting data, and looking at the cost of inaction, I think you will have a better response to your question in terms of what are those impacts and what can we better do about those in the next few months, I would say. And so there are tools out there and there are methodologies. So the first one about gender and the key performance indicators, a quick response is that we need to agree on what those key performance indicators would be for this region. The last slide that I presented kind of suggested in a way where we are. I think we're more between the aware and the sensitive than the responsive, based on the analysis that we did in this, but also some other work that I'm involved in. And that would be my short answer. So yes, we do have a sense, but we haven't done a robust analysis to be able to give you that quantitative data that you're asking for. It is important, and I think it's an area for investment.
Thank you, Lisa. Question from Grenada, recently. As a part of our data collection service, is there a role for collecting gender disaggregated information that can tease apart the different ways in which the different genders value a selected ecosystem? Grateful for your feedback.
Oh, this is for me again? Okay, I understood the question as, is there a way for us to collect gender disaggregated information about how they appreciate or use various ecosystems? Was that it?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Sorry about that. It's just that the volume kind of went in and out there. Yes, we don't have a lot of that, but we can have that information. And part of the value, again, of doing a robust climate vulnerability and capacity assessment, it allows you to be able to collect that information about not only are you using this resource, what are you using it for? Usually, sometimes when we do this work, we tend to look at both the environmental or the economic without thinking about the social. And often there's a lot of social use of resources, and they're different between men and women. We don't know enough about this issue in the Caribbean, but what we do know suggests that they definitely are differential issues. And so, yes, we can collect this information, and there are questions you can use that are available in existing tools, and that can be discussed and agreed amongst various actors that can help to pull out that information for you. Absolutely. That is critical to my mind in terms of being able to look at some of the practice and behavior change that we want to encourage to happen as we do more climate adaptation and more EBA.
Thank you, Lisa.
Here, just to add to that point that was raised by Aria, in one of my slides, I think where we've got in step 1, we do introduce that data collection opportunity to sort of identify, you know, who is in which gender are more involved in a certain activity or delivering an ecosystem service. So step 1 of the toolkit, when you get to see it, there's a very simple approach, which of course can be elaborated and developed as in due course.
I have a question from Deborah Willard Lamb. Is there a regional repository being created or generated on the effectiveness of EBA strategies in terms of engineering function?
It's something that's definitely needed. On an international level, there are other platforms to collect this. There's an initiative that UNEP have set up, which many people may know, which is linked to a project called EBA South. And that is a sort of data collection and monitoring and communication outreach website tool, which stores international EBA practice. A similar model should quite easily be, and can quite easily be set up for the Caribbean and for OECS nations.
We have to, I think we can take one more question if there's one more burning question, and then we move to the next segment. One last question, Joseph, or is that it?
Sorry, one question from Vita Wade. Considering the need for resource sharing, can Adaptation set up a portal where our sharing and collaborations can continue as we go through this process?
I think perhaps I can take up this question. In the first instance, this is, as you'd have picked up from some of the presentations, EBA as a fully fledged concept in the Eastern Caribbean in particular is still growing, and we've been able to mention, we've mentioned a couple of the good practices we've seen, but it's still emerging. But I think the OECS Commission is always keen to accumulate resources that our member states can benefit from. And so going forward with the toolkit being a foreign in this regard, we would hope to accumulate those resources, and also to try to make available to the extent possible means through which practitioners and so on can communicate with each other. But it's also worth noting that at this point we're also preparing to launch a database of EBA and EBA specialists, or experts or practitioners across the region. That should be launched pretty soon online. So we're taking steps in that general direction, but hope to be able to better facilitate conversations, and communication between member states in that regard. And I need to add that the work on the roster or the database of experts is also happening under Adaptation. Sorry. Okay, if there are no other questions, I guess we need to move to the next stage. We've slightly over time, a little over time, but I think it's been worth it. I think we've had some really good presentations and some good conversations. So I guess we're looking at, I guess we can look at what comes next, and I guess I would like to call on Elodie Afonso of AFD. Elodie, you may want to make some comments at this time.
Hi. Yeah, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon for some of you. I think it would be better that Aini, as the team leader of this study, will be presenting the next steps, since she will be the key, I would say, the key focal point for collecting your project ideas. Annie?
Annie, are you able to come in?
Aini? Okay, seems okay, so let's do this. So basically, this webinar was the presentation of the toolkit, and the idea is not to let this toolkit on a shelter, but to help you to formulate some project ideas which will integrate, EBA and gender. For this, so AFD is providing a technical assistance for the formulation of 3 draft concept notes representing several OECS member states. And the idea for you is to submit a basic concept note by the end of this month, so April the 13th. And the proposal will be reviewed by the OECS team to pick up 3 concept notes to be developed by mid of May. The team, the technical expert, will work on the development of those 3 draft concept notes between mid of May and mid of June. And at the end of June, we will organize a second webinar, date to be fixed, but before the end of June, of course, for individual support to the concept notes. We will organize thematic subgroups with the support of the thematic experts. So that will be the next steps. And the idea, is to provide the OECS Commission some good concept notes to be presented to some donors who are already in the region working and funded such projects and programs. Amy, if you want to complete.
Okay, thank you very much, Elodie, for that. Okay, I think that's pretty comprehensive, and I know a number of a couple of persons have asked about the toolkits and when it will be available and how it will be available. Hopefully, it should be available, for example, on the OECS website by next week, God willing, and also we will be looking to send it to the participants, because when you registered, we got your email addresses, so that hopefully is a plan. And we've also sought somebody answered the questions which there were no answers were provided. We have been answering some of these by text, and we will hopefully address some of the outstanding ones. So that is, so these are certainly from the webinar standpoint, we'll try to address these particular concerns. Make sure that you can get access to the toolkit as soon as possible, and also to address some of the outstanding questions. So at this point, I would like to, on behalf of the organizers, the team of consultants, and on behalf of the AFD, on behalf of the OECS Commission, thank all of you who participated in this events. I know that some of you have completed the poll. Thank you very much for responding, and we will use the outcomes of the poll or the feedback to help us in planning for our future events. And just so that you know that this webinar is actually one in a series of webinars which will be unfolding in consecutive weeks, which will be focusing on biodiversity and ecosystems management under the aegis of the OECS Commission. So once again, thank you very much for participating and following today and for your contributions. And thank you also for helping to support this important work. And we're hoping that over time, EBA and gender social inclusion will become more and more mainstream and not be something that's seen as emerging from the left field for some people. And we hope that the toolkit will be of value in your ongoing work. So once again, thank you and stay safe in these challenging times.
Thank you, Crispin. And thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone,
Thanks,
as well.
Lisa.
It was a pleasure.
It was a sincere pleasure. Thank you all the participants for the great questions. We weren't able to answer all of them, but I tried to respond to some of them, as did Annie in the chat. Others, I think, our email addresses are in the presentation, perhaps, or you can access them via the OECS, and I'll be happy to